supported by Protect Plus Gold, a broad-spectrum disinfectant, kills 99.9% of disease-causing germs and works in 10 minutes.
Hello, I'm Alma Angeles, and you're watching Eagle News International. Hello, CJ.
Good evening, Alma, and good evening to everyone watching the broadcast. Here are the top headlines tonight.
Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin kicked off their summit Wednesday with a handshake outside the Geneva villa, where the two presidents plan to confront each other over the worst U.S.-Russia tensions in years.
Famine in the war-torn Ethiopian region of Tigray is on track to spread to other parts of the country, according to a UN official.
The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, slashed its 2021 growth forecast for the Philippines to 5.4% from 6.9%.
And Cyprus dropped its prosecution of police officers for alleged negligence and racism over the disappearance of 7 foreign women and children who were victims of a serial killer. The victims killed between 2016 and 2018 were from the Philippines, Romania, and Nepal.
Two presidents, Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, kicked off their summit today with a handshake outside the Geneva villa, where the two presidents plan to confront each other over the worst U.S.-Russia tensions in years. Now, following an introduction by their host, Swiss President Guy Parmelin, President Biden extended his arm for his first handshake with President Putin since taking office in January. It's always better to meet face-to-face, Biden said, as the two men sat down with their top diplomats, kicking off the summit where ghosts of the Cold War hovered over modern-day U.S. concerns about Russian cyber attacks and what the White House sees as a dangerous authoritarian drift. Striking a positive note, Putin said he hoped the meeting will be productive as the tit-a-tat opened. Now, the setting, a sumptuous villa overlooking Lake Geneva, may be picturesque, but a grueling diplomatic face-off that could last up to 5 hours awaits, with no food breaks planned. The choice of Geneva, following long U.S.-Russian negotiations, recalls the Cold War summit between U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in the Swiss city in 1985. From cyber attacks on American entities and meddling in the last 2 U.S. presidential elections to human rights violations and aggression against Ukraine and other European countries, Washington's list of allegations against the Kremlin runs long. President Putin, however, came to the summit arguing that Moscow is simply challenging U.S. hegemony, part of a bid to promote a so-called multipolar world that has seen Russia draw close with the U.S.'s arguably even more powerful adversary, China. In an interview with NBC, President Putin scoffed at U.S. accusations of dirty tricks abroad and authoritarian crackdowns at home, as well as denying any connection to what the U.S. says are Russia-based hacking and ransomware gangs. President Putin rejected having any hand in the deaths of many of his opponents during 2 decades in power. Putin insisted he also could not be blamed for the near-fatal poisoning and subsequent imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, one of the few remaining major opposition figures in Russia.
In other news, Israel carried out airstrikes on the Gaza Strip early Wednesday after militants in the Palestinian territory sent incendiary balloons into the south of the country in the first flare-up between the two sides since a major conflict in May in which hundreds were killed. The strikes were the first under the new coalition government headed by Naftali Bennett, who took over on Sunday after ousting former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And they come as more than 1,000 ultra-nationalist demonstrators bearing Israeli flags poured into Jerusalem's Flashpoint Old City on Tuesday, with scores of police deployed and international monitors urging calm. According to Palestinian sources, Israel's Air Force targeted at least one site east of Khan Yunis in the south of the Gaza Strip, which is home to some 2 million people. The Israeli Defense Force said that in response to the arson balloons, its fighter jets struck military compounds belonging to the Hamas terror organization. There was no indication of casualties so far. Local firefighters said the incendiary balloons caused around 20 fires in southern Israel. The violence is the first flare-up between Israel and Palestinian militants since a ceasefire came into place in May, ending 11 days of heavy fighting that killed 260 Palestinians, including some fighters, the Gaza authorities said. In Israel, the police and army said 13 people were killed, including a soldier, by rockets and missiles fired from Gaza. In annexed East Jerusalem, more than 1,000 people took to the streets in a delayed and controversial march by nationalist and far-right activists. The U.S. and UN had called for restraint before the march, which Bennett's new administration had authorized. With tensions high, Israeli police were deployed in heavy numbers, blocking roads and firing stun grenades and foam-tipped bullets to remove Palestinians from the main route. Medics said 33 Palestinians were wounded, and police said 2 officers were injured and 17 people arrested. The demonstration triggered protests in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and prompted rebukes and warnings from Israel's allies. The so-called March of the Flag celebrates the anniversary of the city's reunification after Israel captured East Jerusalem from Jordan in 1967 and annexed it, a move not recognized by most of the international community.
Now, this weekend, leaders of the G7 acknowledged the unprecedented humanitarian crisis our world faces today as more than 34 million people teeter on the edge of famine and endorsed a famine prevention compact to urgently address the problem. Take a look.
Leaders of the G7 acknowledged the unprecedented humanitarian crisis our world faces today, as more than 34 million people right now teeter on the edge of famine, and endorsed a famine prevention compact to urgently address the problem. Now, this is a welcome move. The G7 leaders have reaffirmed their commitment to provide $7 billion in vital humanitarian assistance, as well as to take diplomatic action to promote humanitarian access. Now, these elements of the compact are the minimum requirements that must be actioned immediately to save lives. For the next 6 months alone, the World Food Programme requires $4.5 billion, and the consequences of inaction and these funding shortfalls will be measured in lost lives and setbacks in progress towards long-term development goals. To funding issues, the World Food Programme has in many cases taken food from the hungry to give to the starving. We've done ration cuts in South Sudan and in Yemen, and these are 2 countries of concern.
Insecurity is also hindering WFP operations. The organization struggles to reach people in countries such as the Central Sahel region, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. In Tigray, meanwhile, where 350,000 people face catastrophic levels of hunger, humanitarian access is the main challenge to WFP as armed groups are blocking the humanitarian assistance.
In a related news, famine in the war-torn Ethiopian region of Tigray is on track to spread to other parts of the country, according to a UN official. UN agencies say 350,000 people in Tigray in northern Ethiopia are barely surviving in famine conditions, including tens of thousands of malnourished children. Take a look.
I should say that the UK is confident in the reliability of the data that has been presented by the UN. It's clear that food, agricultural tools and livestock are being destroyed. And as a result, 350,000 people in Tigray are facing hunger on a scale not seen since the famine in Somalia. And many more, millions more, face food insecurity exacerbated by disrupted planting. The UK today has announced a further £16.7 million in aid for Ethiopia, which brings to a total of £47.7 million since the conflict began 8 months ago. We called today for Council members to come together and to urge with one voice for an immediate ceasefire and access for humanitarian aid. As I said earlier today, without a ceasefire, this could become a man-made famine. It's not a drought or locusts that are causing this hunger, but the decisions of those in power. That means those in power could also end the suffering. We were told in March that Eritrean forces would be withdrawing. It's now June. There can be no further delay. Farmers have been unable to plant next year's crops due to the violence. The window for them to do so is about to close. And while the violence continues, it is not only condemning the people of Tigray to desperate hunger this year, but next year too. Millions of people's lives hang in the balance. The solution is clear: a ceasefire, humanitarian access, and political dialogue.
Agencies said Ethiopian authorities have reported deaths from starvation.
In other news, a freight train derailed and toppled onto houses along the tracks in western Mexico, killing one resident and injuring 3 others, according to emergency services. Take a look.
A todos, todo el mundo se levantó asustado, pero no son muertos y desgraciadamente un fallecido.
Cyprus on Monday dropped its prosecution of police officers for alleged negligence and racism over the disappearance of 7 foreign women and children who were victims of a serial killer. Prosecutors could not prove beyond reasonable doubt that the 15 officers had been criminally negligent, the Office of the Attorney General George Savides said in a statement. The prosecutor's office said it is clear from case law that however serious, negligence, stupidity, inadequacy, or incompetence do not meet the level of a reckless act required for an offense of neglect of duty. It said failure to connect the missing persons to a possible murder case did not amount to willful and deliberate neglect of duty. Greek Cypriot Army Captain Nikos Metaxas is serving life sentences for murdering 5 women and 2 children after pleading guilty to the killings that came to light in 2019. The victims were between 2016 and 2018 from the Philippines, Romania, and Nepal. The children, aged 6 and 8, were daughters of 2 of the women. An independent investigation looked into how police handled reports on the missing foreigners whose bodies were later recovered in 2 lakes, a field, and a mine shaft. The probe said police had shown negligence in not taking the reports on missing women and children seriously. It was ordered amid public outrage that some of the victims could have been saved had police done their job. The Justice Minister and police chief were forced to resign over the macabre killing spree that went undetected for nearly 3 years. It was only exposed after tourists shooting pictures at a mine shaft stumbled across the first body in April 2019.
The Quezon City government launched on Wednesday its night shift coronavirus disease vaccination program called QC Bakuna Nights. Mayor Joy Belmonte, in a statement today, said this is to be able to address the clamor of many essential workers that belong to the A4 priority category to get COVID-19 jabs. Belmonte said this is for our workers who are unable to skip their 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. work for a day just to be able to receive the vaccine, most especially those whose salary is on a daily basis. About 2,000 essential workers belonging to A4 priority category and who have pre-registered with the city government will be inoculated at the QC Hall grounds today. Belmonte said they recognize the agony of most workers who are undecided whether to be absent or take a leave from work just to get vaccinated against COVID-19. The QC Bakuna Nights will initially run for 4 days, starting Wednesday today until Saturday from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., according to QC Task Force Vax to Normal co-chair Joseph Huico. Huico said this is due to the limited availability of the COVID vaccines.
In other news, UK inflation jumped to 2.1% in May, breaching the Bank of England's target for the first time in 2 years. Here's Ashley Espiritu from our EBC UK Bureau for the details. Ashley.
Thank you.
But there's still too many lives being lost.
For the coronavirus pandemic, with clothing, fuel and oil prices rebounding as the economy reopens, official data showed Wednesday. The Consumer Prices Index hit 2.1% in May, reaching the Bank of England's 2.0% target for the first time since July 2019. The rate compared with 1.5% in April, the Office of National Statistics added in a statement. The ONS chief economist Grant Pfizer stated that this month's rise was led by fuel prices, which fell this time last year, but have jumped this year thanks to rising crude prices. Clothing prices also added upward pressure as the amount of discounting fell. Inflation has accelerated sharply since March, when the government began a phased lifting of coronavirus restrictions, which has also buoyed the COVID-ravaged economy. The latest data stoked stubborn fears of a global inflationary spike as economies recover from pandemic turmoil. The news surprised markets because analysts' consensus forecasts had been for an increase to 1.8%. Head of trading at Infinox said that the easing of lockdown restrictions and the return to growth was just the medicine Britain's battered economy needed. But it's clear that the medicine is also causing severe inflationary side effects. The Bank of England's key task is to use monetary policy to keep annual inflation close to a government-set target level of 2.0% to preserve the value of the pound. The UK reopened non-essential retail, including restaurants and bars, in April, allowing the broader economy to recover further from pandemic fallout. However, this week, it was forced to delay a full reopening due to surging infections caused by the Delta variant. Back to you, CJ.
Well, Ashley, thank you for your report. But you mentioned there that there is a rise in infections due to the Delta variant. Can you give us an update on the development of the spread of that variant there in the UK?
Yes, well, CJ, the UK government on Monday announced a 4-week delay to the full lifting of coronavirus restrictions in England due to a surge in infections caused by the variant, which first appeared in India. Britain will now fully reopen the economy on July 19 now, pushing back the original reopening date of June 21st. Data showed last week that the economy grew by 2.3% in April, recording the fastest monthly expansion since last July on easing the virus curbs. Output contracted by 1.5% overall in the first quarter, although it had already begun to bounce back strongly in March with 2.1% growth. Back to you, CJ.
Well, thank you so much, Ashley, for your report. We are, of course, praying that things get better there and that this new variant will stop spreading fast there in the UK. Take care, Ashley. And again, thank you for your report.
Thank you so much, CJ. I'm Ashley Espiritu reporting from London, United Kingdom, and we live in interesting times.
Meanwhile, the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 pandemic surpassed 600,000, according to figures from Johns Hopkins University, with President Joe Biden mourning the latest sad milestone and urging Americans to press on with their vaccinations. The U.S. has racked up by far the largest death toll of the pandemic, ahead of Brazil and India. Let's take a look.
But there's still too many lives being lost. We're still averaging the last 7 days loss of 370 deaths per day. 370 deaths, that's significantly lower than at the peak of this crisis, but it's still a real tragedy. We're approaching a sad milestone, almost 600,000 lost lives because of COVID-19 in America. That's why I continue to say to America, if you've not been vaccinated, we have more work to do to beat this virus.
The massive vaccination campaign has been pushed by U.S. health authorities since the authorization of the first vaccines in December and peaked in April with up to more than 4 million shots a day. But the pace has slowed rapidly since then, and unvaccinated people still remain vulnerable to the disease. Just over 52% of the U.S. population, or 174 million people, have already received at least one dose of one of the 3 vaccines authorized in the country, according to health officials. Biden has set a goal of 70% of adults to have received at least one shot by the national holiday of July 4.
Well, they should get more people to get vaccinated. People walked down Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles as California, the first U.S. state to enact a stay-at-home order just under 15 months ago, celebrates its reopening day by lifting almost all pandemic-related social distancing and capacity limits. Take a look.
I have a mask for everything. I don't believe the hype. I believe in wearing the mask. I don't believe in the vaccine yet, but I definitely believe in the mask. Wear your mask.
It's totally confusing. I think it should be everybody either not wear it no more. It's not up to individual businesses or companies, owners, to decide who wear it or not.
Basically still following it to an extent, even though I am fully vaccinated. I'm still a little bit hesitant, maybe just because I'm so used to staying home so much. I'm very used to the regulations. But I think eventually in the next few months, I'll start getting more used to going out and living life normally again.
Vaccinated people will be free to ditch their masks in nearly all of the nation's richest and most populous state, though exceptions will remain for locations including public transport, schools, and hospitals. Meeting the June 15 reopening goal, penciled in more than 2 months ago, represents a dramatic improvement in fortunes for California. The western state acted swiftly at the start of the pandemic, but became a U.S. COVID-19 center or epicenter last winter. California's massive vaccination drive has since delivered 40.5 million doses, 16 million more than any other U.S. state, and it has consistently ranked among the lowest U.S. state by per capita cases over recent weeks.
And in New York City, where more than 33,000 died from COVID, life took a major step forward as almost all restrictions were lifted. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said he is lifting restrictions as 70% of adults across the state have received at least their first dose of vaccine against COVID-19. Take a look.
The state mandates that have proven right and correct and brought us through this pandemic are relaxed as of today. Effective immediately, New York State has fully vaccinated a larger share of adults than any other big state in the country, and that is saying something. We're no longer just surviving. We're not in our homes afraid to go out. We're not in our homes disinfecting everything that we can see. Life is not about survival. Life is about thriving.
Restrictions across commercial and social settings will be lifted immediately. Governor Cuomo said some limitations based on guidelines from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention would remain in place, with mitigation measures still required in public transit and healthcare settings. The governor, whose state was the epicenter of the U.S. COVID-19 public health crisis last year, also said individuals and businesses could still choose to adopt some precautions.
Now back here in the Philippines, CHED Chairperson Prospero de Vera III told a Laging Handa briefing that the 73 schools and universities across the country have been cleared for limited physical classes. In May, the CHED chief reported that the agency is looking to propose more programs for limited physical classes, specifically for those that require more hands-on learning. De Vera said they are now crafting guidelines for the said programs. Take a look.
Sa ngayon, 73 na ang mga pamantasan sa buong Pilipinas na na-inspect na ng CHED, ng IATF, ng local government at pinayagan ng limited face-to-face. Pero iba-iba yung schedule nila. Yung mga iba nagsimula na, yung mga iba nasa gitna ng semestre, yung mga iba ngayong school year bubuksan. Pero 73 na, meron pang nakapilang mga ibang pamantasan na ini-inspect pa ngayon. No? So ang lumabas na datos so far, doon sa mga nauna na nagsimula, tulad ng UP College of Medicine at saka Our Lady of Fatima. Kausap ko lang kanina si Dean Charlotte Chong ng UP College of Medicine at si President Enriquez ng Fatima. Zero infection ang kanilang face-to-face. Ibig sabihin, kung talagang tututukan yung compliance sa guidelines na ginawa ng CHED at ng DOH, health protocols at iba pa, ligtas sa mga estudyante dito sa ginagawa nating limited face-to-face. So, doon sa ibang region, meron tayong, ang infection so far na na-monitor pa lang ng CHED ay nangyari sa Region 8. Kaya pinag-aaralan ng regional office ng CHED kasama ng mga pamantasan kung ano ang dahilan at ba't nagkaroon ng infection. Pero sa ibang region at doon sa mga naunang mga malalaking pamantasan, ang infection ay kontrolado.
Meanwhile, Israeli authorities announced the lifting of the indoor mask requirement as its caseload remains low and small. Earlier, Eagle Broadcasting Corporation was able to talk to His Excellency Rafael Harpaz, Ambassador of Israel to the Philippines, who gave us an update on the success story of Israel in tackling this pandemic. Take a look.
Would like to welcome to our program Israeli Ambassador to the Philippines, His Excellency Rafael Harpaz. Welcome to the program again, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me again, Alma here.
Yes. The last time we talked, Israel is already open, reopened your economy fully. Could you give us an update on what is happening now in Israel?
Starting yesterday, no need for masks, not indoors, not outdoors, except for hospitals or people that were not vaccinated, and certainly at the airport. There is no mask. There is really normal life in Israel, completely normal life in Israel. And the economy is start to move fast. We have a fast recovery of the economy. Unemployment is going down. And even tourism is starting slowly with the right measures. So we are doing very well. We beat COVID, and we are back totally back in track, and we are very proud of this. And we don't, as you know, we don't have. You can force people to be vaccinated. Even more than 5.5 million Israelis were vaccinated, but we have a very strict protocols. If you want to travel abroad, for example, you need to do a COVID test and other things. So COVID doesn't get headlines in Israel anymore, I would say. You know, things which is good. We are back. I know many countries are struggling. We are doing very well. But we need to stay vigilant. We need to be. That's correct. So, for example, if you're not vaccinated and you're returning to Israel, you need to go for a quarantine. If you've been exposed, if you're vaccinated and you're exposed to somebody which is sick, you don't need a quarantine in Israel because you are protected. You are vaccinated. And in Israel, the population was vaccinated by Pfizer, even though we have also Moderna, but it's Pfizer. And also, all the 30,000 Filipinos OFWs were vaccinated by us for free All the students from TESTA were vaccinated by us. All the team of the Filipino embassy, diplomats, including the ambassador, were vaccinated by us. All those newcomers, OFWs, which comes every day to Israel, they land and they get the vaccine immediately for free, no cost. Go for it, because we were the first in the world, almost the first in the world, that started a massive vaccination campaign, and we have this herd immunity now, and all the eyes of the world are at Israel, because we are the laboratory of the world. We are a small country. You can't compare it to the Philippines or the US. We are small, but it's very successful, and no major side effects. Because when we started in December, a lot of things were not known. And people were concerned. Now we know the vaccine is working. Yes. And it's working very well. And actually, the country has extended the validity of the vaccine for a year, because we know it's working. So now it's extended for at least a year until the end of December 2021, and so life is very normal now.
What about the Filipinos there? What if they don't have HMOs?
They have it automatically. They are insured. It's a must. You have to be part. You have to be affiliated. That's it. There is no one Filipino that he can go to a doctor. We take good care of the Filipinos in Israel. And as far as I know, we are the first country that offered and vaccinated the Filipinos OFWs abroad. I know it's highly appreciated by the Filipinos.
Oh, we highly appreciate it. Yes.
And we appreciate the Filipino OFWs, because they are caregivers and they take care of our most beloved people, our parents and grandparents. Elderly, and they did an amazing work during this really tough months of COVID and lockdowns that we had in Israel in the last year and the 3 months.
Recently, I know that we had like a fragile situation with the Hamas, but you took care of the OFWs, giving them warnings and all that.
They are part of us. We treat them like we treat them our own citizens. This is how Israel is treating all the years, all the OFWs.
How is the situation now? It's back to normal.
Well, we have a new government in Israel, a new prime minister. It's been exactly 2 days ago. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is the new prime minister of Israel. With a new foreign minister, Yair Lapid. So we wish for the state of Israel that the government will succeed. But we won't accept any, attacks on Israel, something which is very, very important. And not even one country in the world will agree that thousands of missiles will be shot on Israel. And we need to protect ourselves with the right of self-defense.
True. What about flights? Any outbound, inbound travel? Has there been updates on that?
Well, first, flights to Israel are going from all over the world, but from the Philippines, and I'm very happy that PAL has announced formally that they are intending to start flying in October the direct flights to Israel. We are welcoming it. It's been discussed already before COVID and agreed. Now it's in the final process of a lot of bureaucracy, but the intention of PAL to fly, it's a great news. And it will be a successful line, I believe, because the basic thing is the lack of, in normal days, the lack of, no need for visa. When you don't need for visa, both citizens from both sides, this is a basic element to have a movement of tourists, businessmen, between the two countries. And the fact that there is no in normal days, again, now in COVID, it's different times, no request for visas, it's a basic element. Add to this the huge interest of Israelis. I see it in all the Facebook groups. They just want to return to the Philippines, to travel here, to go to the rice terrace in the Cordillera, to Banaue, to Segada, to go to the beautiful islands of Siquijor and Camiguin and El Nido and Boracay and Coron. And the same for Filipinos, which are eager to go back to visit the Holy Land, Jerusalem and Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea and to visit the OFW. So the potential is enormous. We had in 2019, before COVID, we had approximately 35,000 Filipino tourists visiting Israel, in addition to the 30,000 OFWs, which are living with us. And we had around 25,000 Israelis which were visiting the Philippines tourists. So the numbers will grow dramatically, and it will add a lot to our people-to-people contact, to investment, to business, which is already growing So I'm welcoming this decision, and we as a government will assist and facilitate in whatever we can when it comes to this line, which is a very important decision for us.
What can we learn from Israel regarding COVID-19?
Well, I can tell you what are the lessons. There are a lot of lessons that we take from what we have experienced the last bit more than a year. First, we learned that we need to strengthen our medical system. We need to strengthen our doctors and nurses and the other teams that are working. We need to strengthen our hospitals. And this is very, very important. Strong health system is a strong national security. This is first. Second, we have learned that we can work from a distance. In normal days, we conduct this interview face to face. And the working from distance, it has many advantages. Less pollution, less traffic, gives people more time with the family. So this is something that really it's open our doors to new venues and to use new technology, distance learning, and things that were not so developed before the crisis. Mm-hmm. Then we realized, especially in Israel, that we need to give more support to the private businesses, especially the small businesses, because those that work, for the government, for public institutions, they were fine. But those small businesses, a restaurant, a grocery shop, a small furniture shop, they were hit badly during this time because of the lockdowns. And so this is for example, in Israel, we have a very systematic system of unemployment payments for people which are working for getting paid a monthly salary, but it wasn't existing for private business. So now it's something that the new government actually is also going to look into it, and which is very, very important. So these are the lessons I think that, the virus doesn't have borders. So it's international cooperation in this respect is very, very important. And I'm very pleased that when it comes to the Philippines, Israel was capable of assisting the Philippines during this crisis. In several occasions, I submitted donations. We share our know-how, and actually in the coming next week, there is a high-level delegation that will come from Israel to share with your task force and your medical institutions and government and the way that Israel dealt with the distribution of the vaccines.
This is very encouraging news. Going back to your very good news about restoring confidence in travel, you also had mutual recognition of COVID-19 vaccine passports with other countries.
Correct. We had it with, if I'm not wrong, we proposed it to several countries, including the Philippines. I know you're still learning it. We have it, I think, with Cyprus, with Hungary, with Greece, and a few other European countries. And the basic is that we recognize, and Israel for the time being is recognizing Moderna and Pfizer. We don't have AstraZeneca, so I think that's why it did that. And we had the groups of tourists that already arrived in this formula. Mm-hmm. If you're vaccinated and you did a COVID test, then no need for quarantine. And there is certain regulation because we need the industries that were hit most badly were the entertainment industry, the food industry, and the tourism industry. And it's true, we have a very strong internal tourism industry, but that's not enough. So this is a major element now. We need to do it with precautious. We need to be careful, with all those variants. But it's starting, and it's very good news.
Yes, at least the vaccines are proven effective against some variants, though.
Yeah, they're very effective.
Especially Pfizer.
Yeah, they are as far as I know, they are covering almost all the variants in certain degrees, and it's an amazing achievement for the science. If this discussion would take place a year ago, there was no vaccine. Mm-hmm. And now everybody are moving. Also here, I see more and more of my friends being vaccinated, yeah. And I think it's and I tell them if there is a vaccine, just go for it.
Do you think how are Israeli and Philippine relations strengthened despite this pandemic?
Well, actually, during the pandemic, we're dealing mainly, at the beginning, when it started, we're dealing mainly with taking Israeli tourists that were stranded here to Israel. And we got so much assistance from the Filipino government and from the LGUs because they were not based in Manila. They were in the Israelis went to all the remote islands in the Philippines. So to bring them to Manila, and that was quite a challenging the first few months, and we get so much assistance from the Filipino government. Then we worked from the day one with the task force on sharing information about how Israel is dealing with the crisis, how do you deal with public safety, and then afterwards we submitted the assistance both to the Department of Education, which is distance learning material, which is a major issue, and then with the Department of Defense and the Philippine National Police with protective equipment and other equipment, and now we are bringing our top-level delegation in the next week exactly to share this experience, how we did all of this, and again, vaccinating the Filipinos in Israel. I am so proud of this from day one, and makes me proud. And the Philippines were very, very helpful to us. I can tell you, having the OFWs in Israel, so many OFWs returned to the Philippines, but having them in Israel, that was crucial because the most vulnerable population in Israel were the elderly. And in Israel, it's different from the Philippines. Either you go to an elderly home or you stay home with a Filipino. That's the term Filipino is a brand for good people and good service. And while we couldn't meet our parents and grandparents during the COVID, not to, that there won't be, to keep them protected from the pandemic, the Filipinos were there for them, and they did an amazing way. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for what you did for us every day, all the years. But that was the moment that we needed it most. And now I see that the demand is growing because I see every day so many Filipinos coming to the embassy to do their paperwork to go to be as OFWs in Israel. So I'm very happy. Very happy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Any last message for those watching you right now?
Well, I'm going to end very soon my term in the Philippines. And I love this country. I love the Filipino country. It was those last 3 years were very unique and special in our relations. I was a new ambassador 1 week in the Philippines when I was the official escort of your president, President Duterte, in his historic visit to Israel. And since then, our relations are booming. During pandemic, we opened here in Manila, while most embassies are sizing down, we opened for the first time our defense attaché office in the Philippines. Our commercial mission was open here in the Philippines. We inaugurated an honorary consulate in Davao, which is covering all of Mindanao. I'm living with a lot of satisfaction of our relations, a lot of love to the Filipino people, and I'm sure I will be back here as a tourist for sure. And I want to thank you, everyone. Maraming salamat for all of you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for taking care of our Filipinos there and for making them as part of your own. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. All the best. See you. Shalom. See you in Jerusalem.
Eagle News will be back with more updates. Please don't go away.
This portion is brought to you by North Luzon Express Terminal.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Protect yourself and loved ones. Use Protect Plus Gold, a broad-spectrum disinfectant that kills 500 strains of bacteria, fungi, and viruses such as coronavirus and other disease-causing microorganisms. Also potent against viruses in pets. It kills 99.9% of disease-causing germs and works in 10 minutes. Dissolve 1 teaspoon in 1 liter of water. Apply on areas for disinfection or use it for misting. Protect Plus Gold.
Welcome back to the program. The International Monetary Fund slashed its 2021 growth forecast for the Philippines to 5.4% from 6.9%. However, a sharp rebound could come next year if coronavirus quarantine curbs are eased sooner than expected. Thomas Helbling, IMF mission chief for Manila, said a new surge in COVID-19 cases starting in March prompted the reimposition of stricter containment measures, likely slowing the country's economic recovery in the first half. For 2022, the Philippines economy is forecast to grow 7%, stronger than the IMF's previous forecast of 6.5%, according to Helbling. But a resurgence of COVID-19 infections and potential delays in vaccination due to supply constraints pose downside risks to the IMF's outlook. For the recovery to take hold, Helbling said the country's monetary policy should remain accommodative and the government must maintain financially stable and should revive credit growth.
Staying in the Philippines, the national government will not implement new and higher taxes for the rest of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte's term. Department of Finance Undersecretary Gil Beltran said that they will leave the implementation of new taxes to the next elected president while the country is recovering from the recession caused by the pandemic. He added in the Economic Journalists Association of the Philippines, or EJAP, mid-year forum that similar to the previous administration, they have listed possible tax measures for the next administration's consideration. Beltran has not identified any particular revenue measures, but one of their suggestions is to tax the untaxed sectors, such as digital transactions. President Duterte's term is set to end on June 30, 2022.
Now, 10 years after the adoption of an historic International Labor Organization convention that confirmed their labor rights, domestic workers are still fighting for recognition as workers and essential service providers. Working conditions for many have not improved in a decade and have been made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic, according to a new ILO report. Take a look.
Well, in our new report on domestic workers, the key figures are that there are just over 75 million domestic workers in the world. This is a very substantial part of the workforce, highly feminine workforce. 3/4 of the workforce are women, and extremely high levels of informality. 81% of domestic workers work in conditions of informality. And what we're trying to do is to see to what extent we are achieving the goals set in that convention adopted 10 years ago, which, stated simply, are to provide these workers, who are real workers like everybody else, with the same equivalent labor protections on working time, on pay, on social protection as those that are attributed to other parts of the workforce. We're seeing progress, but not yet enough. What we've seen with the pandemic is that domestic workers have lost their jobs in greater numbers than others, or they've had their working time reduced more than others. So they've been hit harder in numerical terms. But looking underneath those numbers, what does it mean? Well, it can mean that domestic workers, because many of them live in the homes of the people they work for, they may have lost their place to live. They may have lost their home. Many of these workers are migrant workers, so their status within a country may be called into question. They may be stranded. So this is very quickly where the drama, and it's always a drama, of losing your job becomes almost a humanitarian problem, a problem simply of how do you get by, how do you survive. This exposes the underlying vulnerabilities and lack of protection which too frequently afflict these workers.
Domestic workers were more vulnerable to the fallout from the pandemic because of long-standing gaps in labor and social protection. This particularly affected the more than 60 million domestic workers in the informal economy.
A mystery bidder pays $28 million at auction for a seat alongside Jeff Bezos on board the first crewed spaceflight of the billionaire's company, Blue Origin, next month. Take a look.
He looks very excited about it. All right.
There it is right for you right here. 28 million, looking for 29 million, going twice. Please make sure you thank all your bidders. Thank you so much for the competition. Wouldn't be here without you. We really appreciate it. We have 28 million in the front.
And he looks very excited about it. All right.
Going 3 times. Thanks, John. All right, thank you. Awesome, thank you. And that is sold, $28 million to number 107.
In other space news, astronauts who will be blasting off on Thursday for China's first manned mission to its new space station meet the media. The mission will be China's longest crewed space mission to date and the first in nearly 5 years. Take a look.
太空跑台、太空自行车等锻炼设备，用于航天员的。
我是有很多的期待的，这次任务也很多。首先呢，我们要把空间站核心舱这个太空家园布置好。
锻炼区配备有太空跑台、太空自行车等锻炼设备，用于航天员的日常锻炼。航天食品方面，配置了120余种营养均衡、品种丰富、口感良好、保质期长的航天食品。航天员查洪波。
因为我是第一次执行任务，压力难免是有的。因为神秘的太空充满着许多未知，空间站任务也充满着风险和挑战。
And farmers are fighting a catastrophic months-long mouse plague in eastern Australia. Take a look.
Worst.
There you go.
Sweet. Yeah, we've been probably catching, probably 400 or 500 a night down that shed here. Yep. And our first night before, we caught nearly 7,000 when we put the trap up. So. My dad's still alive. He's 93, and it's the worst 3 years he'd ever seen in his lifetime. And I think it's probably the worst mouse plague he's seen too. So that's a fair span. That's nearly a century. So.
It was only because you were coming that I put it over here. Yeah. So, that's it. Reckon that'd work? Oh, disappointing. You know, anyone that's stored grain in outdoor facilities like grain bags or open storages have had significant issues. We've seen it in the past. I remember having quite a bit of grain in a 400-tonne capacity storage, which was about half full, and they took 4 or 5 inches off the top of it. You know, like they really did eat a significant amount.
Definitely watching another movie before I go to sleep tonight. That cannot be the last picture in my head. That's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I am TJ Hero. Please join us again tomorrow.
And at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. We'll see you back tomorrow. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live in interesting times.
This program is supported by Protect Plus Gold, a broad-spectrum disinfectant, kills 99.9% of disease-causing germs and works in 10 minutes.